Hi, I'm Kevin, and today I'm going to talk about how to rewrite a version of Redux from scratch. So, why are we doing this? When we understand how our tools work, then we can avoid bugs, we can get more performance out of them, and we're more aware of all the different capabilities that they have. So what's all included? So we're going to cover overall the main functions that come with, the GitHub Redux, which is like create store. The store on it has get state, subscribe, and dispatch. We're going to cover combine reducers. We're going to cover bind action creators and apply middleware. But we're not going to include basically anything relating to the actual view. So React, React Router, React Redux, we're not going to cover any of those. I do have another video on writing a virtual DOM from scratch if you're a little bit more interested in how that works. This example is really streamlined, so there's not going to be any error checking or reporting. That's about half of Redux's actual code. That's really a common thing you see in open source projects is that there's a lot of error checking. We're not going to do dispatch blocking for the purposes of this video. It's a couple of extra lines, but it's an important feature of Redux. We're not going to talk about replace reducer, observable, or preloaded state. I don't see a lot of people using a ton of those things. And then multiple middlewares, that gets into the compose function, and that's probably a video in and of itself, but I'll show at least how one middleware works. So I'll show you a little bit about the project. So you can see here, I've got a really simple HTML document. I've got some increment buttons and some counters right now. They don't do anything. And there's one example per the main function that we're writing today. And here you can see that in the actual HTML document. We've got a Redux.js and then 4 example files. So we're going to basically be filling in this file here, which you can see I've got at least the functions outlined and a couple little notes. You can pause and read them if you're really interested as we go along. And then I've got example 1 here, which is for create store. So I'm going to first kind of go over this example, and then we'll write the create store function together. So the first thing I need to do is enable this. And then, for example 1, so we've got a reducer function here. So I'm kind of assuming that you have some Redux experience. If not, I would definitely start by reading their docs before going into this video further. So we've got a reducer, and it takes state and action, right? And then if the action type is increment, then we're just going to increase our state by 1. So in this example, our state is literally just a number that's going up by 1 each time that action gets dispatched. Then we've got a create store function here. So we're going to create it off of that reducer. Every time we click our example button, then we're going to dispatch the increment action. So this is pretty standard issue for Redux. And then anytime our store changes, we're going to get our state, and then we're going to update that that count span to set it to the current value of the count. So hopefully when we click the button, the count will go up by 1 each time. That's our goal. So let's get started writing with create store. So the first thing is that when we are finished with this, we're going to want to return essentially our store. And in this case, so it's get state, subscribe. Be helpful if I could type. And dispatch. So I'm just going to go ahead and get these guys filled in here. Sorry, my previous version I had 4 spaces per tab, but I've been joining the group with going with 2 spaces per tab. So get state is pretty simple. We just literally need to set a state and then return it, right? So we're literally just returning a reference each time. So this is important to know if you're actually using Redux. The real Redux is like this too, where get state is literally just returning a reference. So, performance wise, it's O of 1. So feel free to use get state left and right. It's not going to really, be any kind of a performance penalty for you. For subscribe, so most of these kind of subscription patterns, their foundation is like an array of functions. So that's pretty much what we're going to do here. So we're going to define an array to store all of our listeners in. And then each time we say, hey, subscribe something, we're just going to add that to our array. And then one of the features that Redux has is it gives you a really easy way to unsubscribe. So every time you subscribe, it gives you, as the return, a function to unsubscribe. So I'm just going to write that real quick. And it doesn't really take any arguments since we already know which listener we're talking about. So all we're doing here is we're just saying, hey, get the index of that listener and then remove it from the array. Splice is going to be an in-place operation. If you were implementing this for real, of course, you would want to check to make sure that the listener is actually in that array of listeners. But for the case of simplicity here, I'm going to skip that. But yeah, again, every time we subscribe, we're really just adding a function to an array each time. And so every time we dispatch an action, we basically need to get our new state. So we call our reducer, which you can see is passed in here at create store. So it's just, it's a closure, it's in scope. And then we're just going to call that with state and action. Remember, that's what all of our reducers take as their arguments. And then we're just going to iterate over all of our listeners. And just call them. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that we don't provide the listener when it gets called with the state and action. It would kind of make it so that you really wouldn't have to use middlewares quite as much if you did that, because then, basically every time you dispatch, you could just, what all of your listener functions would get the state and action each time. I think the authors of Redux really wanted to push people towards using middlewares instead of the subscribes for everything. So I think that's why you see it the way you do. The last thing is that dispatch always returns the action. That's really important for middleware. So when we're working with middleware, we will need that action to come out of dispatch. And it's also useful too to know when you're using Redux that every time you dispatch, the result of it is the action itself as well. And this is actually it. This is our entire create store function. You can see it's pretty simple. There's not a lot to it. And this is most of Redux. This is most of the pattern already here. So hopefully now, if I go to my example page and I refresh and I click this button, oh, I think I have a typo. Listener.push, okay, I think I misspelled. So let's try that again. So now you can see my count is going up for example 1. I'm just gonna make that a little less roomy. And that's it for create store. So most of Redux is actually already explained at this point. So we'll move on to the next one, which is going to be combine reducers. So combine reducers is really just a utility function. You absolutely do not have to use it in order to use Redux. If you prefer doing things a different way, you absolutely can. It's not attached to the main store really in any way. It's just a utility function. But it's nice that they provide it out of the box because then it gives people kind of a, a convention to use instead of just everyone doing it their own way. So you can see again here, we have our reducer. Again, our state is just a count, about the same thing here. Um, and this is what we're going to be making work, which is, hey, I call it combine reducers, where the count state is set by this count reducer. So our state is going to be like, instead of just the number, it'll be like an object where the count is the value. And this is equivalent to this function here, where it's just a reducer that returns an object where the count, and then the count reducer operates on the count part of the state, and it's always given the action. So this is what combine reducers does every time, is it just kind of takes down writing all of this out each time into this, slightly simpler way of writing. Big points to notice here, though, is that it is a function still, so combine reducers does need to return a function, and then the return of that function needs to be an object. So those are kind of the two big things to note there. And then we're going to create our store with that reducer just as before, and the rest of this is pretty much the same. When we click the button, we want to dispatch the action, and then every time the store updates, we'll get the state and we'll update that state in our document. So let's go ahead and write combine reducers here now. So this one isn't too bad. First of all, we'll get all the keys of that reducer's object, right? So if you remember again from our example, it's like count, and then it's set to that count reducer function. And then we're going to return a function since, we need a reducer out of this, and it's going to take state and action just like a reducer does. And then I'm working on ES5 here, so I'm going to do this a little old school, but basically we want to make sure that we always have a state. And then we'll essentially say that this object is going to be our next state. So we never want to change our existing state when we use Redux. We always want to create a new state object each time. And then we're just going to iterate over all of those keys. And then, so the next object at that key is going to be reducers at the key, given the state at that key and the action. So you can see that this line is almost exactly a representation of, keep going to that one, of this. This is almost identical, right? It's the key, the reducer of that key receives the state at that key, and then the full action. So you can see that that, is pretty much the same thing here. The next to the key is the reducer at the key, is the state at the key, but then it takes the full action. So that's the biggest thing. And then at the end of this, we'll just return next. So I'm just going to make sure that I've got my example 2 here uncommented. And then we'll go ahead and run that, and hopefully it works. Sweet. So that's it. That's all there really is for combine reducers. I'm just going to go ahead and close these other examples so I don't get all confused. So yeah, it's basically just a utility function. It's a nice standard way of kind of doing things, but you absolutely don't have to use it if you don't want to, or you just have a different way of you want to work with it. So the next function to talk about is bind action creators. So this one's pretty simple too, and it's again a utility function. Basically what it's going to do is it's going to give you a way to just have a bunch of functions that will automatically dispatch actions for you. So we'll go over this example here. So again, our count reducer to state action increases 1 each time. Here's our good old friend combine reducers again. We're going to create that store. So this is where the new piece comes in. So we have an object of action creators. And then we have an increment count action creator. And all it is a function that returns an action, which is just a plain object with the type of increment. And then bind action creators is going to take this object of action creators, and it's also going to take our store dispatch function. So those are the two things it needs. And then it's going to return bounded. So this is one place where this is changed here, is instead of just dispatching, type of increment directly, now all of my essentially bounded action creators, when I just call increment count on here, not only does it, return type of increment, it also calls that with store.dispatch. So this line is basically the same as this line. So store.dispatch action creators at increment count, right? So, or it's just really this plain object of type of increment. So it's just basically another utility function that kind of acts as a building block for, building applications that might have a few dozen of these different action creators. If you're using React Redux, you probably even don't use this function directly because it's kind of taken care of for you. So here in bind action creators, I'm just going to say, hey, this is, the object that we're going to return here at the end. So it is going to be a new object. And then because we're only ever calling this once, I'm just going to do object.keys here. In our previous example, I did it up ahead because, you do call your reducer multiple times. And so, it's just a little bit of a performance optimization. Whereas in this one, we really don't care about that. So we're going to iterate over all of those keys. So again, in this case, it's really just count. And then we're going to say, hey, our action creator is going to be, at that key. And if you look at the actual Redux code online, you'll see that they are using ES6. So some of the things that I'm having to do a little bit more old school, they've got it, with the ES6 way of doing things. So, and then for our returning object at that key, again, it's going to be the same function name. What we're going to give it is a function. So we're going to, that way we can just call it, and that's going to give us both the dispatch as well as the action creator. And then again, here I'm kind of doing this old school. I believe the real Redux uses an ellipsis operator. But here you can see that I'm just basically getting the arguments as an array. And then I'm going to dispatch our action creator. And because Redux is basically trying to be completely functional programming, immutable, it never uses the keyword this, so there's really no point in passing that along. And then, the arguments is going to be an array, so we're going to call our action creator with whatever we received and then just wrap that in dispatch. So again, all it's really doing is giving us a new object where all the functions have been wrapped by the dispatch. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that example 3 is online. And then we're going to see if we can run it. Oh, I made a mistake. Argument is not defined. That would be the word arguments that I need. Yep. So arguments is just, kind of a keyword in JavaScript that every function, when you have it, it gives you all the different arguments. It's just built into the language. So let's run that, and you can see my increment is working here again, which is very nice. So that's all there really is to bind action creators. Again, it's a utility function, so it's not really critical to use with Redux, but it's kind of a standard that they're trying to put out there. Our last function here is apply middleware. So middleware is kind of the one thing I would say that, at least on my own team, there's just been a lot of confusion about what a middleware is and what it does and how it works. So essentially, what's going to happen here is that we're just basically replacing our dispatch function. We're wrapping it. So just in the last one, the way that we wrapped all of these action creators with dispatch, in this case, we're actually wrapping dispatch in all these other functions that are middleware. So you can kind of think of it as being like kind of like a callback. It's actually pretty similar to a callback. There is kind of one nice capability of it, which is currying. So I probably do want to explain that a little bit here. But yeah, so basically, a middleware is just wrapping the dispatch. It's overriding it, and then when you call dispatch, it doesn't just call dispatch. It also calls all of your middleware. And then again, as I kind of mentioned earlier in the video, I'm only going to cover, in this case, one middleware. But if you wanted to do multiple middleware, then you would need to use the compose function, which will compose all of your middleware into just a single function. So there's a kind of two function signatures here. You'll see apply middleware takes middleware, create store, and reducer. And then middleware takes store, next, and action, right? This syntax probably looks a little goofy. If you haven't seen it before, this is currying. So the idea is that rather than just having a straight list of arguments, essentially you would have a function that then returns a function, right? So I can kind of show you how that works. So if we had just kind of a boring, add function, you would kind of imagine it being just like return a plus b. That's what happens when you have two arguments. Now, the curried version of that would be like a function that just takes a, and then that's going to return another function that takes b. And then inside of there, then we actually do our operation. So this works because we have the scope here. So A is in scope and B is in scope. So then, essentially rather than calling it like, add 3 and 4, you would add curried 3 and then 4, right? So these two expressions would get you the same result. The advantage with currying is that you can do this. So add 3 equals add curried of 3, and then you could call add 3 of 4. The nice thing though is that it makes it so that you don't have to keep providing those same arguments over and over again. So that's a pretty common thing that you'll see, as we're doing apply middleware. Go ahead and close example 3. So let's look at example 4. So we have our count reducer. It's exactly the same. We have combined reducers. That's exactly the same. I've gotten rid of the, the bound action creator thing here. I've gone back to just dispatching. This is really the part here that is new, which is our middleware. So here you can see I said store, like, hey, apply middleware. And it's going to take our middleware, it's going to take create store, and it's going to take reducer. So those are the 3 arguments, if you will, for apply middleware. And then I've written this out. This is a middleware. Now, normally you're going to see this with like, the equal arrow function, or sometimes called the fat arrow function, where it's like store, fat arrow next, fat arrow action. This is the same thing. This is what that would actually compile down to. So we've got essentially a sync, and then the arguments are store, next, and action. And then our middleware is just going to call next, and it's going to say, hey, okay, if the action type is increment, and then alert incremented. So if our middleware works, then essentially we would expect, it to alert incremented and then update the count each time. So apply middleware, it's not as bad as it sounds, but conceptually all we're really doing here is we're going to create a new store, but we're going to overwrite the dispatch function. So again, apply middleware takes middleware, create, store, and reducer. It's incurring, so we have to, write it in that style. So it takes middleware, create, store, and then it takes our reducer, right? So those are the three arguments, quote unquote. And then at first here, I'm just going to show you. It's just we're gonna create a new store. So we're just gonna do create store, given that reducer, kind of the same thing. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and say like, hey, if you remember above, I had get, state, subscribe, and dispatch. So I can even just take that because we're just gonna pass those along. And then that's gonna be of the scope of the store. And so right now we're not really doing anything with the middleware, but we are creating a store and passing those on. So hopefully if I enable example 4 here, then you can see it is incrementing it each time, but our middleware hasn't been applied. So we're gonna go ahead and apply our middleware here. So we're gonna overwrite dispatch. So that's gonna be a function. It's going to take an action because dispatch always takes an action. And then we're going to call our middleware. And if you see up here, its arguments are store, next, and action. So I'll just go ahead and do store, next, and action. Right. One thing you'll notice though is that next is not in scope here. Next would actually come more into play if you were doing compose to do multiple middleware. But here, next is really just store dispatch. So we're just going to call dispatch and then we're going to call our middleware is basically how this is going to go down. So I'll go ahead and run that now. And hopefully if everything has worked, you get an alert and then the count goes up. So cool, and that's really all there is to apply middleware. Again, it's kind of a source of confusion. You can just basically think of it as a callback if you want to. It's basically just going to overwrite our dispatch function and then apply all of our middleware along with calling dispatch. So that's really all there is to it. There's not really a ton of magic to it. So all of that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. So not too in depth, and hopefully it wasn't too difficult to understand. Yeah, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching.